Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gabriel Brodbar. I'm the Executive Director of the NYU Reynolds program, and I would like to welcome all of you to this afternoon's talk, Go Big or Go Home, with Darell Hammond of KaBOOM, Billy Shore of Share Our Strength, and Amy Celep of Community Wealth Partners. I also want to extend a welcome to everybody in cyberspace that's joining us through our live stream. Darell, Amy, and Billy are here because they want to share with us some of the very important lessons that they're learning as they try to transition their organizations from ones that focus on treating social wounds to ones that prevent them from happening in the first place. And these are very important lessons, not just because there are 16 million children in the U.S. living in poverty, and 1 in 5 is struggling with a mental illness, and 1 in 3 is obese or is overweight. They're also very important lessons, I think, because Darell, Billy, and Amy are really leading by example. They're forging a path that can make that very difficult journey of trying to realize real social change a little bit easier and hopefully a little bit more effective for the rest of us. Of particular importance to us at NYU Reynolds is the fact that they're practicing their leadership in a way that really personifies some very important social entrepreneurial principles. And these are principles we do an awful lot of talking about, but perhaps don't get to see in action as often as we like. And I just want to briefly touch on 3 of these. One, they each practice deeply honest self-reflection. They write in their great Stanford Social Innovation review piece, "When Good is Not Good Enough," and if you haven't had a chance to read it, I highly recommend it. They write, quote, "We recognize the pathology we describe because we practiced it. We shortchanged ourselves and those we meant to serve." Now, these are really powerful words. They can alienate funders, they can discourage stakeholders, but this kind of modeling of self-assessment and self-reflection, I think, is absolutely critical to anybody who's serious about real social change. 2 is, I think, the fact that their work focuses on outcomes and not processes. They recognize the fact that if we're ever to realize a more just and equitable planet, the frameworks in which our organizations operate and how we operate, the frameworks in which we personally operate, really have to be transformational. They can't be transactional. So from my perspective, they're really setting for themselves and for their organization what Jim Collins calls in Good to Great, big, hairy, audacious goals, which is also a very important part of social entrepreneurship work. And the third is that these outcomes and goals that they focus on are root causes and they're not symptoms. What difference does it make if they're able to triple the number of mouths fed or quadruple the number of playgrounds built if the underlying causes of poverty are producing the symptoms of hunger and lack of play at a much, much faster rate? As the late, great Greg Dees put it, the survival or growth of a social enterprise is not proof of its efficiency or effectiveness in improving social conditions. I think Darell, Billy, and Amy really recognize this, and they practice this in their work. Proof of effectiveness here doesn't come from the $376 million invested in fighting hunger, or the 15,000 playgrounds already built, or the 6 million children already helped, as laudable and as valuable and deeply needed as those things are. Proof here instead would ultimately come from putting their organizations out of business by achieving these very bold and refocused missions. And I don't think it gets much more real or big or hairy or audacious than that. So please join me in very warmly welcoming to NYU Reynolds, Billy Shore, Darell Hammond, and Amy Celep.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Gabe, for the warm welcome. So I want to start off today by asking you, by a show of hands, how many of you actually indulged and watched at least a few minutes of the Sochi Olympics? Raise your hand. Almost everybody. Okay. So the Olympics, in my opinion, are a great example of going big or going home, which is the theme of today's talk. You see snowboarder Shaun White, you see figure skater Gracie Gold. And my question to you is, do you think they trained their entire lives just to do well, get a good score, have a better time? No. They trained their entire lives to win the gold medal. That's what we're talking about. We want to win the gold medal. And I think we have a lot to learn from the Olympics and from Olympians around this. We, as a community of social entrepreneurs, have a moral obligation to go for the gold, to go big, or to go home. So if you think about the 16 million children in this country who are living in poverty, is it okay to say, we're going to help 1 million? We're going to help 1 million kids. What about the other 15 million? What happened to them? So, I would argue that in our sector, too often, we set incremental goals that lead to incremental results. Or, as I'm sure you're all familiar, we set goals that, frankly, we're not quite sure what they really mean. They're kind of vague, and we're not really sure what the results are. I see some nodding heads. So, unfortunately, while this is going on, the problems that we're tackling are getting worse. I'm sure there are some problems that are getting better, but if you look at many of the statistics in this country, a lot of these problems are getting worse. And I think we could all say that what we're doing isn't really good enough. And that's the sentiment that really has led both Billy and Darell to visualize success in an entirely new way. And one of the things, if you read about Olympians, that you'll see that their coaches do that we may not all know, is their coaches actually have them visualize themselves winning that gold medal. Visualize themselves kind of soaring to the top, doing their very best performance. That's what we need to do, and that's what these two leaders have done. And we've tried to capture that in the article that Gabe mentioned earlier, When Good is Not Good Enough. And what we really argue for is that we as a community, collectively, have to stop setting modest goals that provide short-term relief, and we really have to start setting those bold goals, those long-term goals that aim to solve social problems once and for all. Our team at Community Wealth Partners has had a tremendous privilege to work with leaders like Billy and Darell, but a lot of others as well, who really are making this kind of dramatic improvement. And one of the commonalities that we've seen across them is that they do set bold goals, really clear, bold goals. As clear as winning the gold medal. I don't think you could get more clear than that. I think we know what that means and what it looks like. And that's what these leaders have done. And a lot of people call them crazy, and a lot of people call them unreasonable. But I would argue that that's the very thing that has led them to achieve more than they would have otherwise. So dream big, you achieve big. So I'm going to give you two quick examples outside of the stories that Billy and Darell are going to share of others who've done this. So take the designated driver concept. How many of you have heard the concept of a designated driver and know what that is? Fascinating. So that campaign was actually launched in the 1980s, and before that, it wasn't really a concept that was known in this country. And yet all of you know, and we're a bunch of different generations in this room. What was their goal? It was to make the designated driver concept a social norm in this country. To make it the default that you would use a designated driver when you were drinking, and to dramatically reduce alcohol-related fatalities. There was a concerted effort to spark a movement around that nationally. We've reduced alcohol-related fatalities, and clearly, from your hands, we've established a norm, and everybody knows what it is in this country now. Other countries, we were basically following suit. Other countries had done it previously as well. The other example is the global anti-malaria movement. So we've actually eradicated malaria in certain parts of the world. Today, about 90% of the deaths from malaria occur just on the continent of Africa. And Malaria No More is one of the organizations, along with hundreds of others, that's trying to battle that. In 2006, Malaria No More set a goal to not reduce, but eliminate deaths from malaria in Africa by 2015. And since they set that goal, they've reduced, as of last year, they have reduced malaria deaths by 33%. It's pretty dramatic, That's thousands and thousands of lives saved. So, my challenge to you today is Billy and Darell are going to share their stories of the shifts that they've helped lead their organizations through. And my challenge to you is to just allow yourself today to think differently and bolder about what it is that we can accomplish together and how we actually might get there. So I'm going to leave you with that, and I'm going to turn it over to Billy.
Great. Thanks, Amy. Thank you. Thanks, Gabe and the Reynolds program for having us here. Thank all of you. And a special treat to be here with Darell, who just does such heroic work at KaBOOM and who is, as you'll hear, is incredibly generous in terms of sharing their learnings and making sure that others benefit from their work as well. I love this topic, Go Big or Go Home, because I feel like it covers so many of the, and has embedded in it, so many of the issues that all of us deal with in the nonprofit sector, whether they have to do with sustainability or scaling or collective impact or any of the trendy buzzwords that are now part of what we do. I think of Share Our Strength as a scaling organization, primarily, probably more than anything else. The focus, of course, of our work is childhood hunger, but what we've really had a core competency in is scaling, and we've scaled mostly by investing and working with others. I have in the back of my head something that my son said to me this weekend, which I feel is so true of all the work that we do. I've got an 8-year-old son, and it's been his long-held fantasy to have a camp out with me and him in our living room in our Washington, D.C. apartment and build a tent out of blankets and dish towels and kitchen chairs and things like that. And so I said, look, we can do this one night that's not a school night. And so that was, I think, last Friday night. And we had a little lantern and we read some stories, and I had a guitar and we sang some campfire songs. And then he said, you're going to be here in the morning, right? You're not going anywhere. And I was like, no, I'm going to stay the whole night. So we had our sleeping bags. And if you want to know the full range of opinion about how much fun this is, ask an 8-year-old and a 58-year-old, and you'll get some really divergent views. But of course, so he slept like a brick. I tossed and turned all night. And the next night he did what any 8-year-old kid would do, which is he said, can we do this again? And I said, no, we said we were just going to do it the one night. I said, I'm going to sleep in the bedroom with Mom tonight. And he said, well, I want to do it again. And we had this little tug of war. And he said, well, fine, I'm sleeping out here. And so he got in a sleeping bag, and I went into our bedroom with my wife, Rosemary. And about 30 seconds later, he's standing in our doorway with his blanket in one hand and his teddy bear in the other. And he says, who am I fooling? I wouldn't have lasted a minute out there on my own. And I thought, well, cute, but so true, right? Like, really, which of us can do this on our own? I mean, this is collective work. And people talk about collective impact. They say there is no other kind of impact. So for me, that just kind of underscored it. What I'll tell you about just very briefly is this kind of transition that we went through at Share Our Strength. And I think Darell's going to talk a little bit about the same thing with KaBOOM. And in some ways, our transition had to do with motivations that were almost intensely and intimately personal rather than external or even necessarily strategic in a sense. So we'd been an organization that for many years had been better known for the way we generated funds than what we actually did with them. We had a lot of entrepreneurial strategies and cause-related marketing and community wealth strategies that made us a pretty financially successful organization. Less attention was being paid to what we were actually doing with the money, and we were granting it out to lots of other organizations, and everybody was satisfied with Share Our Strength except those of us at the very core of the organization. So we were getting good press, our friends and families were proud of us, all the organizations we granted to enjoyed working with us, but those of us at the core of the organization had this nagging concern that, were we moving the needle? Was the glass half empty or the glass half full? Were we actually solving a problem? And we had noticed that there was kind of this classic trajectory for nonprofit organizations, which is you get a good idea, people gravitate to it, you grow, and at some point, though, you plateau. And almost every organization I've been involved with, and there's quite a few of them, have been on this same trajectory. And we realized that at one point that we had plateaued, that we were stuck. If you use revenues for only as a proxy for that, I would tell you that in 2006, 7, and 8, our revenues were stuck at about $13 million a year. And the needs were growing. Certainly with the recession, the issue of hunger and childhood hunger was growing. Our own internal costs were increasing, but there we were within $100,000 every year of $13 million. We knew we had to get off that plateau, and we made some decisions to do some things differently, which resulted in the following year, 2009, getting to 19 million, 2010 to 26 million, 2011 we're at 33 million. Last year we closed out at 48 million, and this year we'll be at about $55 million. So big increases for us after being stuck for quite a long time. And as I say, that's only a proxy. That still doesn't tell you about our effectiveness, but the reason we grew is we really asked ourselves some questions, mostly around the issue of what does success look like for us? Have we really defined in a really clear, crystal clear way that we could be accountable to what success looked like? And we realized there was an opportunity not just to feed kids, but in our case, with one segment of what we do, because we were working internationally, nationally, across all demographics and populations, we realized that when it came to children in this country who were hungry on a chronic basis, that was actually a solvable problem. We thought a lot about something the writer Jonathan Kozol says, which is pick battles big enough to matter but small enough to win. And when we asked ourselves what's big enough to matter but small enough to win, we realized that kids in America who are hungry on a chronic basis, you could actually solve that problem. So we thought, first of all, in terms of go big or go home, let's set a goal that was bold but achievable, one that would be credible but would be a real stretch, and that in our case was ending childhood hunger by a time certain. We said 2020, that got moved up to 2015, which we can talk about in the discussion, which is problematic for some different reasons, but it had a catalytic impact on our stakeholders to know that we could actually solve a problem by a certain time. We also realized that capacity equaled impact. We had to invest in our own capacity as an organization, and that nobody was going to do it for us, and we had to make certain assertions that by investing in things, even at the expense of doing less service in the short term, even at the expense of making less grants, even at the expense of reaching less children in the short term, we believed that we had a strategy that if we invested in it would enable us to reach 10x or 50x number of children just 2 or 3 years later. That proved to be the case for us, but it took a little bit of grit and discipline to hang on to that strategy, even at a time when we weren't putting as much out into the community as we once had. We also found that accountability was a very powerful differentiator in a crowded marketplace, that there's so many organizations doing so many important things that for a stakeholder with no apples to apples measurement to be able to tell whether $1,000 invested in KaBOOM or $1,000 invested in Teach for America or $1,000 invested in Share Strength got them a better return, that at least if we could say, here are the specific benchmarks that we're going to measure ourselves by, you'll know if your investment is paying off. The fourth thing for us was understanding that we had to intersect in a very robust way with public policy, that there were things the nonprofit sector could do that public sector could not do. We could innovate, we could take risks, we could be closer to the people we served, and therefore build programs that were more effective, but that when it came to scaling them, we had to have a public sector component. And as we get into the Q&A, we can talk about what Share Our Strength has done to leverage existing food and nutrition programs like school lunch and school meals. Last two things I would say is we understood that we had to become more competitive as an organization. We had to learn how to compete. We all talk about collaboration constantly, and we do collaborate with a lot of other organizations. But we had to learn to compete, not in the sense of putting somebody else out of business, but to be the best version of ourselves. I spent 10 years on the board of the Timberland Boot and Clothing Company, and one of the things I learned there was that the board of directors of that publicly traded company and the senior management was very focused on ensuring that the company was organized to outperform its peers. And that mostly what they understood, which I had not completely understood, was that to be competitive at any level, you must compete at every level. So at Timberland, they weren't just competing to sell us boots. They were competing to have the best people in the world who worked in fashion and footwear to come work at Timberland. And what they measured at Timberland was not just how many boots they sold, but how long their senior people stayed at Timberland versus how long senior people stayed at their competitors at Cole Haan or Echo or Clark. They weren't competing just to sell us t-shirts and apparel. They were competing to have a brand that stood for sustainability and environmentalism and the outdoors. So this notion that to compete at any level, you must compete at every level. We have almost the knee-jerk reaction, opposite reaction in the nonprofit sector. Our reflexes are, how do we do it cheap? How do we do it free? How do we do it pro bono? How do we do it with what's left over, as opposed to what are the best resources available? And so we realized we had to turn that on its head. Last thing I would say is we got very focused on how we start to intersect with what we think of as the national conversation. If there were enough people that cared about children and child hunger, we wouldn't be doing the work we were doing for as long as we've been. But people are talking about other issues that have to do with schools and education and jobs and the economy. And we had to make the case for how our issue fit into that. And so we did a lot of work with Deloitte, international consulting firm, on measuring the results that Share Our Strength got in the schools where we work, where they found that math scores were 17.5% higher, attendance rates were a day and a half longer because the kids were fed, projected graduation rates were better, reading on grade level was better. And we're able to make the case that programs that some thought we might not be able to afford to invest in, we actually can't afford not to invest in. To make the case that you can't have a strong America with weak kids. So that's just a short checklist to frame some of the conversation of some of the decisions that we made that ultimately did, in our case, really charge our growth and have created finally what should happen in the nonprofit sector is a more responsive marketplace so that a higher performing organization does get rewarded, can get the revenues and the resources it needs to become an even higher performing organization. So just a small slice of the learnings, but let me turn it over to you, Darell, to take it from there.
Great. Thanks, Billy. So for those that know KaBOOM, we actually build playgrounds, and we had been doing it for 15 years, and I had just come off a book tour where we were out inspiring audiences about the process that we went through and the partners that we were able to work with and the impact that we were having. And ironically, I actually was listening online to a speech that Billy had given as they had started to go through this metamorphosis as an organization. And one of the things that he said was, how do we start to think about not just making problems less worse, but actually solving them? And it caught me at a time, and I think the senior management and board of KaBOOM at this time, where we were asking ourselves, we know we're making a difference. The communities that we're able to work with, you can see it in the physical transformation, you can hear it in people's voices, and you can watch the kids playing on the playground. And we knew that we were having an impact because people went on to run for school boards, the playgrounds got maintained, and long-term, kind of the confidence of the community was increased. But we weren't doing it at the size of the problem as it existed. And we build about 150, 200 playgrounds a year. It goes up and down, and we get thousands of requests. So even for the ones that we were working on, we weren't doing it to what the size of the problem was. Coupled with the fact, you could argue what actually impact were we having? And so we partnered with Community Wealth Partners to say, let's actually more sharply define our bold goal. And that bold goal is, how do we give kids active and balanced play? And if they do that, how do we make sure that that sets them on a trajectory to be able to thrive and grow up and become healthy and successful adults? Which meant that from a programmatic perspective, it couldn't just be a way of describing what we did differently. We were fundamentally going to have to do things differently. And when we wrote the SSI article, we were just in the middle of that process, beyond just having laid the framework, to say, now we need to actually morph into working differently to achieve scale. And the first thing that we had to really do after adopting the kind of bold goal was to talk about, we're not trying to scale KaBOOM as an organization or scale KaBOOM as a program. And that what we needed to be thinking about was, what was the behavior change that could be scaled? And if we got that to a tipping point, how does that help a cultural norm start to come place where society wants to promote and protect play from happening? And the choices that we then needed to make was very different than thinking about how many more playgrounds could we build, where could we build those playgrounds, than to think about why is play important in kids' lives, and how do we make sure that everywhere they're at, they're getting it, including on the playground. So what does bus stops look like? What do sidewalks need to look like? How does the school environment be used in a more playful and purposeful way? Because that's how we're going to get to the behavior change. And if we again get to the behavior change, we get to that responsibility piece where people start to promote and protect it. And I think from an organizational perspective, it's incumbent really for us to think about all kids can benefit from more and better play and a balance of play. And particularly the type of play that's best for them is not more of one thing, it's a lot of everything. So electronics is not bad for kids, but if it's the only thing they're getting, it's going to be bad for them. One type of activity or sports is not bad for kids, but if it's the only thing they're not getting the variety, which is where they're really going to be able to kind of thrive and actually have exponential growth and opportunity to actually, have that childhood that they deserve. So all kids can benefit from this, but as an organization, we needed to think about the 16 million kids living in poverty. And we're really excited to be working on, just very quickly, the city of Chicago. And the mayor, Emanuel, there is, we think, an early indicator of what's possible when you work on behavior change. And we see this wonderful convergence of thinking about how do we start building family-friendly and child-friendly cities again. And we think the mayor in Chicago is one of many that's doing an amazing job to think about how do we attract families back into the urban core and how do they thrive from a quality of life perspective. And play is an important component of that glue that makes families want to live actually in urban areas. So it's things about not just where playgrounds are, but how big are the sidewalks? Could they be bigger that encourage socialization? Is there recess and PE at school, not making you take a choice between one or the other? Do you have safe routes to school options before? Do you have programming before and after school? Are you putting resource allocation and capital money against this? And since writing the article, we've come a long way, but frankly, we're still just at the starting line to really try to see this strategy manifest itself in terms of grassroots leaders, people on the ground adopting the behavior of playing differently with their families, and then grass tops leaders to really think about what's the transformation that we could potentially achieve if we didn't just think about providing one more playground, but provided an environment, an atmosphere that play can happen everywhere, every day, and not only kids, but families and communities will benefit and thrive because of it. We're probably still a year behind where Share Our Strength and the No Kid Hungry is, but we're excited to be where we're at, and it requires you to work very differently both to get there and to think about where you actually got to go so that we can solve this problem on the scale it exists versus making it just a little less bad for only some kids.
Great. Excellent. Thank you to you both. So what we're going to do now is we are going to just engage in some conversation here. I have some questions for Billy and Darell, but I'm sure you have questions too, so please jot them down, and we will have some time at the end for you to come up to the microphones and ask your questions as well. So my first question, you've both shared a little bit about what the goal is and some of the ways you've had to work differently. I'm curious, what are the risks that you face as a result of setting these bold goals? And kind of what are some of the ways that you and your boards have thought about kind of addressing or overcoming some of those risks?
Well, I guess to me the most memorable pivot point in this for us is when we first had this idea of ending childhood hunger by a specific deadline. We called together many of the organizations that we work with, probably 60, that we work most closely with in a Washington ballroom, had our PowerPoint presentation about how to end childhood hunger. We fund at least 2/3 of these organizations. And at the end, when I sat down and we asked, what people thought, at least 58 of the 60 were passionately and energetically opposed to what we had suggested. And I realized that, and they had asked questions about how much is it going to cost? What about other forms of hunger? What if the economy changes? But there was really an undercurrent, kind of a subtext of almost cultural discomfort with being accountable to a very specific outcome. And I recognize that within our own organization, so I don't say that critically. The hardest job we had at Share Our Strength was getting our inside circle, our team, to be comfortable with the idea of we're going to know at any given time how far away we are. So if we've said we're going to add 74,000 kids to school breakfast in the state of Maryland, and we're only at 23,000 today, and we said we were going to do it in 3 years, then okay, we're a third of the way there. But here's how you're going to be judged. And we'd set these very specific goals for our No Kid Hungry strategy was based on enrollment in programs like school breakfast, summer meals, WIC, food stamps, SNAP program now, and after school care. So people feel very accountable in ways that they differ from before. And that's the biggest risk is to me not that you will fail, because failure is just a part of it. But the biggest risk is that you won't succeed in getting people to embrace the risk itself.
Yeah, I think to add on to that, I think that our biggest risk is revenue. We have a fee-for-service model with corporations who come out and volunteer on playground projects and see a very tangible result at the end of it. And I think as we've gone through this metamorphosis, there's been some attention paid to, we're so good at that and already $30 million. That takes time, attention, effort, care, and feeding. How can you do this and be best in class at that like you are at this? And won't this divert your attention, focus around the quality and consistency that you already deliver? So I think that there's going to be partners who continue to work in this way for us. And we had an aha moment at a board meeting where we were talking about this strategy as a pivot. You were in that board meeting. We were talking about it as a pivot, and people felt a pit in their stomach because we're not moving away from what we actually have been doing. We want to make that even stronger and more robust, and we're investing in it. But at the same time, we do want to extend on top of it. And once we started to talk about it as an extension, framing it differently, I think it allowed our partners to see that we both have the attention and focus on building great places for kids to play through participation of community members and corporate volunteers, and this idea of how do we help build a culture of play happening everywhere so that kids can thrive. We're not at the point where the revenue has come in, but there's good indication that there are going to be new partners that will probably step to the plate that weren't necessarily interested in employee volunteering. And so we're finding partners that are aligning around outcomes, and our values are very similar. And now it's about, can we align around strategies? And those type of conversations are taking longer to germinate than to convince somebody to build a playground in their hometown or one of their factory towns or facility towns, but they're the right type of partnerships, and we're excited about where we think we're at and where we're going to get to. But revenue is an important kind of conversation that our board constantly has about as an indicator of both the consistency of our core business and the ability to tackle this other work.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because I think that we see in a lot of the work that we do that it's not about deciding you're going to do this new thing and abandoning the old. It's about building upon the foundation. And you actually gain credibility by building playgrounds and being in communities to do the other work and to advocate at the national level and to do those other things. So I think that's a really...
And in doing that work, I think that it's also imperative that the project management team within our organization is the earliest adopters of anything we do. And that whole team has actually embraced this bold goal faster than any other department in the organization, and working with the partners in ways to say, let's just not build a playground together, let's build a playground that actually changes your behavior, that makes you play in a balanced way. And they start it from the first touch with the community, and it ends way after the playground's already built. And we have these different milestones that we can start to say, our kids in the community playing differently through the process, not just the build, and how catalytic has it been?
I mean, there's one other thing I think I would add here, and I'll only interject it because it's such a threshold issue. But to me, the other risk is accepting somebody else's conventional definition of success at the very beginning, which could just doom everything else you do. So in our world, the conventional metric of how people are doing on the issue of hunger is the Food Insecurity Index, based on the Department of Agriculture and census takers asking families, do you feel anxious at some time in the month that you're going to be able to feed your family well? The problem with that is there are always, even when the economy is booming, even during President Clinton's economic growth period, there's always whoever's in the bottom quintile, the bottom fifth, wherever that is, feels insecure. And so those numbers barely ever change. You can't win on that metric. We said we're going to use a different definition. We're going to look at the fact that there's 21 million kids in the country who get a free school lunch, and only 9 million are getting breakfast, even though it's bought and paid for all 21 million. In the summertime when the schools are closed, only 3 million get summer meals, even though it's bought and paid for all 21 million. So huge opportunity. Money that is an entitlement program with so much bipartisan support that it's exempt from sequestration, from the automatic budget cuts. So we said, look, let's get those numbers to where they should be. And if kids are getting breakfast, lunch, after-school snack, summer meals, the appropriate level of SNAP benefits, you can say a lot of things about their families, about whether they're food insecure, whether they live below the poverty line, but you cannot say that they're hungry if they're getting 3 meals a day. So we completely changed that definition, and we're successful selling that redefinition, but our entire strategy depended on changing that conventional measure.
That's great, great. Thank you, thank you. So I'm going to get personal for a minute. So you face these risks, you face people who doubt the new direction or who are critical when you talked about standing in front of that room of 60 people. Do you ever have your moments of personal doubt? And talk a little bit about that. What do those moments look like, and how do you, as a leader, kind of move through those times?
Yeah, I think one, I'm probably very intrinsically motivated, and intensely private. So although you have those moments of doubt, you still put on a happy face and go out there and do your job and charge forward. I'm fortunate to have a wonderful, supportive wife that is a balance to this with me, and a great team. And I think the more vulnerable you can be as a practice, not as an approach, you build this level of authenticity where it's a constant thing, not a thing that you actually have to schedule into a performance review or a time of year where you're going to do this self-reflection. And there's I think in this change, which really been interesting for me in the last 9 months, my role at the organization has changed drastically. And we talk about in the SSI article that we have to open up new circles. And for 17 years, I've known the community we needed to influence. And now we're saying we have to influence mayors and park and rec directors and city councils and school boards. And it forces me to use my time differently. And it's a different skill set to try to influence them on the issues that they care about. And it's something that you have to get over and get good at.
Yeah, yeah. That's great. Billy?
Yeah, I would only add that if you don't have moments of doubt, you've set your goal in the wrong place, because the idea is not to do something that's easy or that everybody else is doing. The idea is to try to move the ball forward to a place that it hasn't been before. So doubt's got to be an inherent in that, and I think it's just a tension that you manage.
Can you talk about some of the strategies you've used to influence skeptics? Some of the different kind of tactics, strategies, techniques you've used to kind of get them to be on your side? Or has your strategy been to let them be a skeptic and let them be?
Well, I probably wouldn't have had the answer to that 30 minutes ago, but as I was walking in here, I was passing the Judson Memorial Church, which is right next door, and there's this great little thing written on the window there from Pete Seeger. So I wrote it down. It says, "The key to the future is finding the positive stories and getting people to tell them to each other." Right? Pete Seeger was one of my heroes, and I love that this idea of finding the positive stories, getting people to tell them to each other, and that's really what we've done with the No Kid Hungry campaign. Because on the one hand, you're saying we're going to end childhood hunger by a time 8 or 9 or 10 years off, and on the other hand, you need immediate positive examples to keep people connected to this. So, for example, in Los Angeles, I visited a school called the 52nd Street Elementary School, and the principal there, Principal Jimenez, told me that they've got 850 kids at this school, and they've always measured perfect attendance, and they've traditionally had 250 kids with perfect attendance. When they moved breakfast from the cafeteria, as we urged, to the classroom, to the first 10 minutes of first period, their attendance went up, the perfect attendance went up to 450 kids, from 250 to 450. And he said the correlation between attendance and reading on grade level and graduation rates is pretty profound. So I've told that story enough times now that I've started to hear other people tell it who, they have no idea where it started. But again, people need that kind of positive example to hold on to. We've got lots of them. But I think to the extent that you can give people a sense that, yes, this is a solvable problem, yes, what we're doing works, yes, I can give you a concrete example, those are all bridges to where you want to get to.
That's great. Darell?
I might add 2 points. Billy talks about this in one of his books, is get people to bear witness. Actually go out and experience and see it and feel it, because they take away a very different understanding than a report or somebody sitting across the table from them. And I think it's a powerful way to enroll people into seeing the lives of the people we're trying to impact. And I would say the second thing is really important that we're learning around telling stories is sometimes people are risk adverse. And when they're risk adverse, telling them what Mayor Emanuel's doing or Sioux Falls, Iowa is doing helps them see actually what's possible and themselves in that similar role to say, actually, this is doable, as Billy talked about. So, I'm becoming more of a Pied Piper for play and talking about what are these emerging, interesting ideas that people are working on but don't necessarily know about, get credit for, and trying to dominoes that to other cities across the country.
That's great. That's great. Well, thank you to you both. Thanks for sharing your strategies and your personal moments of doubt, which do tend to be very private a lot of the time. So I want to go to talk a little bit about a point that you mentioned about competition, Billy. So I know that in both Share Our Strength and KaBOOM strategies, collaboration is really important. And the reality is that there's a lot of competition for funding among the organizations that you are collaborating with. And so I'm curious to hear a little bit how you've dealt with this challenge of getting people to collaborate, partners, funders, those on the ground, while there's still this sense of competition in our sector around funding. So what are some of the strategies or techniques you've used to overcome that? What have you seen others doing? And maybe some ideas on how we reframe the conversation in our sector so that it doesn't become such a stumbling block.
Yeah, I'd say for us it's still a work in progress, because we've used lots of different models. So we've got the No Kid Hungry campaign, which focuses on these student enrollment in food and nutrition programs. In some states, we have what we think of as an owner-operated model where everybody who's working on it works for Share Our Strength. In other states, it's more of a kind of a general contractor with subcontractors, so we're making grants to other organizations to do that work. In some states, it's more of a franchise model. The key, though, has been to give more people a sense of ownership of what we do. I would say that my experience has been that 90% of the time when organizations think they're competing, it's the perception of competition, but not the reality of competition. Greg Silverman's here, who works on our Cooking Matters nutrition education program. And I remember years ago, Greg, before even you started with Share Our Strength, when we brought Cooking Matters to New York, there was a New York organization that was also doing nutrition education, and they were kind of very upset that we had come, and we said, well, how many people are you serving? And they said, well, we're serving 9,000 people, and we said, well, we're serving about 7,000 people, right? So that's in New York City, that's only 16,000 people. There's a lot of room for both of us to grow, and almost every issue that I've dealt with, solving the problem at the magnitude that it exists means that there need to be lots of other organizations. And so, Feeding America is an organization that, we collaborate with 90% of the time, and we compete with a very small percent of the time. We might find ourselves in the same corporate marketing office looking for a corporate marketing, cause-related marketing partnership. But it's really small relative to where we collaborate, and I think you have to kind of parse out where it's real and where it's perceived.
And I would say that in the playground space, there's not much competition, and our success will be if we can get 100,000 flowers blooming and create competition and more people actually working on and against this issue. Both new organizations like Playworks and the Alliance for Childhood, fabulous groups. They need to be scaled up and getting more resources and bigger. At the same time, we do too. So yes, we'll compete for some limited resources that are out there, but we both need to get bigger. And I hope that new organizations or organizations that are focused on kids actually take up the play cause too and competes for resources with this as well, because it just means more people working on the issue and we try to solve it faster.
Right.
And I think built into the notion of scaling is making sure that there are other organizations that they're doing this. One of the most important things I learned from one of our board members a long time ago, a man named Wally Doolan, who was the CEO of La Madeleine and before that TGI Fridays. He said to me once, he said I could never build a nice family restaurant, but I could build 100 of them. And he was a scaler, right? He was brought in to take a concept, and it's a completely different set of skills. And it means completely recasting the culture of your organization to do it. So Share Our Strength has never built a school breakfast program, but we've built thousands of them, right? Because we've just taken those ingredients and used a set of scaling strategies and techniques that are very different from what it takes to actually start something. And I think that distinction often gets lost.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Well, why don't I start with you, Darell, because I know I've let Billy kind of go first a lot of these times. I'll go with you first on this one, and that is, so there's a book that Kurt Vonnegut wrote, for those who are Kurt Vonnegut fans, called Bluebeard, and he talks about there are 3 types of people that are needed to start a revolution. He talks about the authentic genius, kind of the visionary, and then you need the person who validates the visionary and kind of agrees with their point of view and their idea and validates them. And the third is the communicator, the person who can pretty much communicate just about anything, including the idea or the vision, to just about anybody in a compelling way. So I think for this audience, we've probably got a mix of folks here who might become the visionaries, who might become the communicator, who might become the validator. And I'm curious, for those who are trying to figure out kind of where they fit, what advice you might have for how one thinks about kind of their own skills and goals and values and experiences, and evaluate kind of and figure out where they fit and what their role is. Because it's not just the visionary or the person who is the social entrepreneur who starts something. There are a lot of other roles to be played in the work that both of your organizations do.
Yeah, I think in my case, I started this at 23. I didn't set out to start an organization, but I ended up having one, right? And then you go through these different ages and stages where it requires you to have different skills. And then you get to a point where it's really got to be about team. And I think we're really at how do we get a team that complements the skills to be able to do this very nuanced approach in a different way. And so I think the advice is to know what age and stage you're in, your tolerance for risk, and then who else do you want to authentically surround yourself with. You know, I had the fortunate opportunity to years ago hire the COO of Ben & Jerry's, who ran KaBOOM for 9 years and still works with us. He had worked with founders, and he was on our board, and then he came into our organization and frankly mentored me up as a CEO, having worked with 2 CEOs. At this stage of the organization, he still works with our joint venture Imagination Playground, but James Siegel is now running the organization. And we have very complementary skills. And I think I've heard James say to students that come through the office that he probably couldn't do what I do, but he makes me do what I do better. And there are things that I can't do what James does, but I hope that what I contribute makes him better as the COO of the organization. And the complementary skill set is that I'm going to push him outside of his comfort zone, and I want him to push me outside my comfort zone so that we both can, and all of us can grow together. And sometimes that's uncomfortable, but that's where the biggest growth comes. You know, I say in my book that sometimes we spend too much time getting better at what we're already good at, instead of spending more time on trying to get better at the things that can give us the biggest lift. And I really think I try to spend more time on what I'm not good at and how can I constantly get better at it than hone my skills on what I'm already good at.
That's great. That's great. Hone your skills on the things that you're not good at. Billy, what's your advice?
My advice would be, I guess, as much as I love that Kurt Vonnegut construct, I would not think about it at all. Honestly, because I feel like no, I say that because I feel like I would have, there's nothing that would have stopped me from trying to do what I did. I always think there's a great classical pianist named Richard Good who says that he says your strength as a performer comes from where your need is. You should only play the music that you really have to play. The audience will hear the accent of honest feeling. And I love that idea. It goes to the authenticity point that you were just making, Darell, this idea of the accent of honest feeling. So I think you just have to, ask yourself whether you have the skills or anything. What is it that you really want to do? And I'm in the same position as Darell. I had to bring in a lot of people who do a lot of things better than I do as we grow. The organization, by definition, changes in tremendous ways. And so, if at the core of that, whatever set of skills you have will be one set, and there will be a skill that you don't. But if at the core of that, you're so committed to achieving an outcome, you'll surround yourself with people who complement and bring what you don't have. And all of us have strengths and weaknesses.
What are some, as you've both shifted from the more transactional to transformational, what are some of the qualities that you're looking for in the people that are by your side to kind of charge forward and realize that vision that maybe were different than before? I mean, how do the people look different? What are the skills, attitudes, characteristics that you feel like you need?
I mean, I think that as we go to an influence strategy, we need people who understand influence. And so, we've got, head of development at KaBOOM here in our external affairs who are new people to the team based on this new strategy that says we're going to need a very different revenue strategy and we're going to need a very different way of communicating our message in the marketplace. Instead of doing what we were already good at in the past. And so these people come with, frankly, much more deeper experience in thought leadership and sales approaches and techniques and that what we were currently used to in selling infrastructure playgrounds. And then the teams that they surround themselves with look very different than a kind of a one product organization that got really good at what it did. And we're frankly still at the beginning of it and still have a lot more change that we need to go through in terms of getting the talent in the organization to actually get to the transformation instead of a little bit more iteration.
Right. Billy, how about?
I think a lot of different qualities. I guess my shorthand for it is I look for jaywalkers. I don't want somebody who's just standing at the light waiting for it to change. I always look at people on the metro who are standing on the elevator even when it's going down and they don't move. They don't even just walk down the steps. I would never hire one of them. So I don't want to hire felons. I don't want to hire felons, but I do want to hire rule breakers, and misdemeanors are okay with me.
That's a good one. That's a memorable one.
That's right.
That's a memorable one. Excellent. So I think what I'd like to do is open it up to all of you. So you're going to notice there are 2 microphones. And so we welcome questions. We ask not for comments because we don't have enough time and we want to get as many questions in as possible. And to please try to be as succinct as possible. Introduce yourself, your organization, and then state your question. And please let us know if you're directing it to one or the other. Please, go ahead.
Hi, Marianne Fernandez. I am founder and president of Philanthropy Indaba, and I work with philanthropists. So you may have answered this question in part, but I wanted to approach it from a different angle. So you talked a lot about the risks and challenges of getting your teams and your partners on board with a bigger vision, a bolder vision. But funders often get very complacent with the way things have been going. They like the measurements that they've been used to and, steady outcomes. What were the difficult conversations that you had with funders about this shift, and how did it turn out?
I mean, I was in the taxi on the way over here having a conversation with a funder that, so I think you got to be aligned on outcomes, values, and strategies. And at any one point, it can fall apart. And at some places, it's uncomfortable and it's different. We've gained we're going to gain some new partners. We're not going to grow with other partners, and other partners are just simply not going to come along with this new approach. And it's difficult, but it's probably worth it if this is what we've decided that we need to do. I think part of the challenge that we need to recognize here is how do we get them to own the outcome and not the credit, and that the outcome here is a generational change. And this one company that I'm working with right now wants to see results in 5 years. And we'll have proxies in 5 years, but we're not going to have the real evidence on is kids going to grow up better to be healthy, successful adults in that period of time. So what are the appropriate proxies, or what's the leap of faith that you need to build that it's a 10 and 20-year value proposition? We're still in the middle of it, I can tell you.
And I would say, and I won't bore you with all the details, but we worked very hard. We don't have many traditional funders, so I think Darell's answer is probably more relevant than mine. But from the beginning, we tried to build a lot of these corporate marketing partnerships that I talked about, and about 2/3 of our revenue come from them. And so as long as we deliver marketing value back to our partners, unlike the usual dynamic, they're not challenging us on the programmatic side of what we're doing. Like if we weren't having impact, they would probably start to challenge us, but it's less of an issue for us.
So Billy just delivered the line, I put our people in the front row to hear. We want to have independence ourselves, so thank you.
And we actually, in our case, we would never have gotten to our strategy, that pivot that we made a few years ago, if we had traditional funders. At least we wouldn't have gotten there as soon.
Great, thank you.
Great, thanks.
Hi, my name is Arshia Karani. I'm in my final semester as a graduate student at NYU Wagner. And I'm studying policy and finance, and my concentration has been housing. And my perspective is that a lot of social issues are kind of pawned off onto the education system in terms of community building, and I always try to look at it from what is the responsibility of a community from a housing standpoint. And I was wondering, for both of you guys, what you think the role of housing communities and affordable housing in particular is to build these safe environments, and what kind of policy shifts you think are necessary, and that new graduates like myself can start working on and like angling our perspective on in order for better and safer communities.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that well enough, except to say that I know that, unless you've built a community with safe and affordable housing, all the other things we're trying to do don't get done. So to me, this is a kind of a seminal threshold question, and I'm glad it's your focus, and I hope you'll solve it more than we have, because it hasn't been mine, and I just don't have the expertise in it. But I think you're right to call it out, because it's that's the ecosystem in which all of these programs are going to be working. So it's vital. I guess we need to all do more to help people see the links.
And the only thing I think I can add is we can't pit and parcel kids apart and think the education system's going to take care of this, the housing's going to, they're whole children. And so how do we build a safety net for whole children to thrive and succeed versus parceling it off for different people to take different responsibilities for?
That's great.
Thanks.
Excellent.
Hi, my name is Julie Sawicki. I work at Wagner at NYU. And all three of you have touched on the role of political work and advocacy work in your missions. And to me, that feels a lot different from the sort of internal, like day-to-day products that you're delivering. It's more of reaching out to these more complicated factors and other people making decisions that you don't really have control over. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about that and how it plays into your strategy, and maybe at what point it might become more important than the more day-to-day hands-on projects you have.
It's really good.
It's too early for us. I mean, it really is too early for us.
In our case, it turned out to be very important. When I mentioned on that kind of like list I was ticking through that public policy had to be a robust component, one of the things that we really kind of scratched our heads about for a long time was, why are there still so many hungry kids in this country? It kind of didn't make sense. We've had all these programs in place for a long time, and we've had all these private organizations doing great work as well. So the fact that this issue was kind of stubbornly not changing caused us to drill down a little bit. And when we realized this dynamic of how many kids were eligible for these programs but not involved, the irony is predecessors of all of ours fought these battles and won them 30 or 40 years ago. So I was with Marian Wright Edelman a few months ago, somebody who I revere, and she was talking about the summer food program. She said, we fought that battle 30 years ago, yet everybody kind of patted themselves on the back and went to fight the next battle. Today, only 13% of the kids that we won this legislation for are benefiting from it. So before we fight the next battle, let's get the other 87% there. One of the first conversations I had was with Governor Ritter from Colorado, who was governor before the current governor. And I went and said to him, Colorado ranks 45th lowest out of 50 states in the percentage of kids who are actually enrolled in these programs. And he said, well, what's that mean? And I said, well, one thing it means is you've left $150 million in Washington. That can only be used to buy bread from your bakers and milk from your dairy farmers and supplies from your vendors to feed your kids so they can do better in school. And he was kind of horrified, and he looked at his staff and he said, is that possibly true? And they, kind of pulled out, yes, sir. And he said, well, why did we need this nice fellow in the blue blazer from Washington to come tell us this, you know? And I say it because it was an example for me. Here's a really good governor, by the way, former Peace Corps member, working on food and nutrition programs in Zambia when he was in the Peace Corps. So I knew he really cared about these things. But he didn't know that this was the case in his own state. So to me, it was a testament to not only how vulnerable are the populations that Darell and I are talking about, but how voiceless they are as well. And to me, the key question of advocacy is one of voice. You know, are you willing to use your voice on behalf of others? It doesn't have to be to go lobby, to become a registered lobbyist and make political action committee contributions. It could be just going to governor's offices saying, do you realize that there's an opportunity here that you're missing? Because kids obviously don't belong to organizations, they don't hire lobbyists, they don't make PAC money, and they don't go into governor's offices. And so, you know, being that voice, I think, at some point, for most of our organizations, becomes a component.
Yeah. And I might add one thing to that, just given we work with a broad array of organizations, is that I think we're increasingly seeing that organizations that do direct service very effectively and have evidence of that effectiveness are realizing that we kind of call it influence strategies. We are realizing that influence strategies are so critical and that they actually are really well positioned to do it because they've been on the ground, they have evidence, they know the stakeholders, they know the issue. And so I think it's never that one should replace the other. I actually think the two work very well hand in hand.
It's a great point.
So,
yeah, great point.
Thank you.
why don't we go to this side?
Hi. So my name is Misha Byrick. I'm the Manager of Strategic Partnerships at DataKind, which is an organization using data science to tackle humanity's greatest problems. We're using a similar fee-for-service for facilitating pro bono engagements. And I'm hoping you could talk a little bit more about the evolution of your business model and how you were able to balance philanthropic and donation-based revenue, Darell, with an actual earned income model while still maintaining integrity as a nonprofit and focusing on mission and impact.
Yeah, I mean, we're about 92% fee-for-service driven right now, and from corporations who are basically buying the product of a playground build. So it's really too early for us to tell you about the success of revenue diversification to support this new strategy, because we don't have the annuity of a cause-related marketing stream that helps us self-fund the pivot in the strategy and the programs that we want to. So, you know, our team has been working with Billy's team about how they did that, how they built that, what does that look like. So not that, again, it's too early for us to really say we've got this strong fee-for-service revenue model. We need to keep that strong and growing. That gives us both the credibility and at the same time diversify in a way that gets our strategy funded versus programs that funders want us to do, and unrestricted income that helps us control our own destiny long term.
Billy, do you want to add anything? Nope, we're good.
So,
Excellent. Why don't we take the next question?
Hi, my name is Allison. I'm a graduate student here at NYU Wagner, as this whole side seems to be. And this is actually a great follow-up to this gentleman's question. Is I would love to hear more about how you two think about partnerships, because one of my favorite things about social ventures is the way they often are able to expand the pool of available resources by engaging other sectors. And I'd love to hear more about it. I think KaBOOM did a great job. You're 92% funded by partnerships like that, which is, I believe, what you just said. And I'd love to hear more about how you try to think of strategies that can engage people and create more resources than were previously.
Well, it's a great question, because I learned from the master. Billy spoke at IEG in Chicago, and I think Billy's been instrumental in my sales force from day one. I called his assistant one day, who actually wrote the first piece ever about KaBOOM. He wrote a 5,000-word essay, and it got cut to 75 words in Who Cares magazine. But that got us to Kimberly Clark. And Billy was giving a speech in Washington. I called his assistant and said, can he rattle off our name in there? He talked fondly about us, and Kimberly Clark signed right up because we had all this credibility. And then I was in a car with him in Chicago. And the question I asked him was, we had a project that we were getting ready to fund, and we had one current funder who wanted to do the project, but I wanted to use this for new business development to get a new funder in. And Billy said, I always leave the dance with the person who got me there and take care of the people who got you there. And we gave the project to the one that was already a partner of ours that then substantially grew with us because they saw that we were going to treat them always right and best instead of use them to get the next big business. And I think there's a lot of about approach about, if you price it appropriately so that you're actually delivering what you say, and the quality's there, people are going to come back and continue to want to work with you. But it is both the strategy, approach, and a practice that you got to get good at doing it over and over and over.
Well, I warned you that Darell was very generous, and he is overly generous in my case. But I would say, the other piece of that for us has been to think about partnerships as, 9 times out of 10, at least my experience, when a nonprofit organization, just use corporate partners for an example, goes into a corporate partnership discussion and says, we have some ideas about what we can do together, and here's what we think would be good for you. They're guessing, and they're guessing wrong. And so to us, the whole kind of secret sauce has been not guessing, but asking, right? And it's not just, it doesn't have to be a corporate partner. It can be a community partner, a programmatic partner, but really asking a lot of questions. When we do it with corporate partners, we're asking, what are your sales challenges? What are your employee morale issues? What are your public relations problems? We want to know all of this, and they're not used to being asked or expecting to answer to a nonprofit. But unless we know what they're trying to accomplish, how can we say this partnership is good for you? And we've got ideas of why it might be good for them, but again, we're only guessing. So, just like you would in any relationship, that ability to kind of listen and then to digest and think about, okay, we've got some assets that if you think of them as wet clay, how do we now shape them so that this is good for you and good for us? As a grant maker, which our strength has been for all these years, we almost invariably have somebody that comes at some point in the year and says, we don't want to just be a grantee anymore, we want to be a partner, which is their euphemism for being a bigger grantee, right? We want more. And I'm like, no, so where's the partnership here? What are you bringing to the table? And so, that notion of like we both have to give value to each other is I think, pretty key.
Great. Thank you. Thanks. Why don't we go to the other side?
I remember my question. Terrible memory. I'm Marnie Braddock, and I'm a Wagner student about to graduate. And I was just wondering how you see your organization's approach to curing systemic problems change as philanthropic giving shifts more to in-kind donations and maybe even more social impact investments down the line.
Yeah, well, I would say for both of us, partly what Darell was talking about, both of us are at, we're at different stages, but neither of us are at the finish line. So it is a work in progress, I think, in terms of trying to build a diversified set of resources that are not too vulnerable to any one change in funding streams, whether they're philanthropic or they're corporate. In our case, we've had a little bit of the luxury of not having to pay as much attention to shifts in philanthropic giving, which like, they change over time. And so, again, this idea of really understanding what value we have to deliver. And with most of our corporate partners, I can tell you before they tell, not me, but our team, could tell you before they tell us if they're going to renew the partnership for another year or 3 years or 5 years, because we've been so clear on what value we each need to get from it. It's so measurable that we can look at it and say, no, we didn't deliver that value. I'm sure they're going to come back and say, we don't want to partner with you anymore. Or the opposite, which is we did, and why wouldn't they continue? But at the end of the day, we've had to diversify. So for us individual donors, even after we're 30 years into this now, and it's only in the last 3 years that we've built a base of individual donors. And it's become sizable for us, but in the scheme of things, it's still very small. So that diversification, I think, is probably where we're both trying to head.
Excellent. Why don't we take the next question?
Hi, my name is Joy Steffen, and I work with social benefit organizations as they evolve and grow. My question is about the behavioral changes that you talked about in order to adopt the new group norms. Specifically internally within your organizations, I'm interested to hear about the new group norms that emerged and some of the behavioral changes that you observed that had to happen in order to get everybody bought in to your big, hairy, audacious goals?
Good question.
I think for us it was, myself and the executive team set the direction and kind of the annual plan for the organization. And now what we're doing is setting the priorities and asking the teams to be, what is the best way that you see based on your knowledge, experience, and wisdom for us to get there? So you're pushing responsibility and ownership down into all levels of the organization to come up with the programs, approaches, strategies, techniques, to get the exponential type of activity, and then leveraging the management team in external ways and helping set priorities in a very different way. And then you also have to deal with the skill set changes. Significant amount of wisdom and experience where you really want everybody to participate. And if you're in a meeting and you're not participating, we have to figure out why. And if you're in a meeting, we really need you contributing. Otherwise, we need you doing something else. Because if you're not in the meeting contributing, we can send you an email about what happened. And so we have to find more voice in everybody owning these things to go further faster. Externally, I would say we're really excited because we're very methodical about identifying some of the barriers that exist to why kids don't play, and then doing some behavioral science pilots around what might be some of the things that we can prompt and do differently to actually have breakthroughs. So not doing it based on anecdotes, but doing it based on real behavioral science studies to reduce some of those barriers, to see if we can push that out into people's activities in a different way.
I'd say for us, what you're talking about created some real stress points for us, because our culture really did change significantly, and we had to bring in people with a whole different set of skill sets and different ways of working. So, for example, we brought in a number of people with political campaign experience, which I had 25 years ago, but we had been an organization that was, kind of people in both the culinary industry, which is where we started doing our organizing with restaurateurs and food service, and we had people that were kind of a good account managers for a lot of these corporate partnerships. But as we started to develop these statewide campaigns and work with governors and others, we brought in a lot of political folks who had a very different style, and we had some culture clash within our organization that it became the job of organizational leadership to sort out. And one of the ethics that we've tried to instill is the notion that the most important audience for your work is the person sitting next to you. If they don't get it, if they don't support it, if they're not enthusiastic about it, how in the world is a group 3,000 miles away in Oregon or Washington or wherever going to be aligned with what we do? So and again, still work in progress for us. And I don't think it's a problem that ever gets completely resolved, because as we grow farther, we will need additional skill sets different from the ones we have even now, and that will create some change as well. But I think helping everybody see what their role is in achieving the goal, not a unique management philosophy, obviously on my part, but so that everybody from the person who answers the phone to the person who's leading the organization all feels like they're responsible for the outcomes is pretty key.
Great, excellent.
Hello, my name is Jen Ritchie. I'm from the Partnership for a Healthier New York City. I'm their communications director. Just to build upon, I've always been very excited about doing cause marketing, corporate partnerships. To this point, we've solely been publicly funded by the CDC, and we work very closely with the health department. Any advice around getting buy-in from those around me to sort of branch out and diversify our funding streams and to try some innovative ways to bring in funding without losing credibility among our public health peers?
Yeah, well, first I would say that I don't believe that any one way is better than any other way. And I wish we had some of the public funding that you have, for example. So I think ultimately world-class organizations have to be good at, if not all of it, a lot of it. I also think being really clear about what your values are and what your standards are and what lines you won't cross. So, for us at Share Our Strength, we work with a lot of different types of corporate partners. But we've also made it clear that there's certain corporate partners we won't work with, either because their values aren't aligned or we tried working with them and We just didn't like the way they were doing things. And so knowing, just for your stakeholders to know that there are those boundaries gives people a sense of comfort that you're not, just going to sell sell yourself out to the highest bidder.
And I would just add pilot, then grow. And I think the title of this is go big or go home. But we're saying that from a very different 30 years, 18-year experience. And if it's something new, you've got to show success. And you've got to create the opportunity so that people can see that it's possible. And it's too many times that people want to jump into only the big thing and not to actually do little pilots that may or may not work that can indicate what may be the big thing you should zero in on.
And at a really practical level, I'll add one thing, and that is that I would bring people in, like the Billies and the Darrells of the world, to come kind of talk to the senior leadership in the organization. And I think that when people have an opportunity to ask all the questions that are scaring them and that they're fearful about, that they're worried about, sometimes those things get alleviated. So.
Thank you, and I welcome you.
Hi, Daniel Petter-Lipstein. I do community work and education. Big fan of both of you. Your work and your organizations. I was interested in how, at different points, you were talking about behavior change, and it seems like both of you are trying to address, you've got these amazing programs and environments, and yet the populations you're trying to serve are not taking advantage of them. And I'm wondering, both from your vantage point, Billy, and you, Darell, what are either the models or strategies or the insights that you've kind of internalized or tried to put through your organizations about these are the things that really cause behavior change and get to adoption, so that we went from X number of kids having school lunches to Y kids, and are you using those possibly, Darell, or are you using other strategies to say these are the things that we've started to at least hone in on that are going to get people to actually play, move, etc.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think we have a fundamental influence arc that has several steps in it that says what we do know is that the awareness that play is important has been plus or minus 90% for a decade. So people think play is important and it actually has benefits on their health, their ability to learn. So that's not the problem. Awareness is not the problem. But then the responsibility in their own home and becoming advocates for other people to do it, to the societal norm, that funnel's not happening. So we've adopted an influence arc that says, okay, how do we put people in these different buckets? And then what do we need to do to help them to both see themselves in this role and then to prompt them to move to the next role? And it's relatively brand new for us. We only ourselves decided on the influence arc just months ago, and we're doing some different iterations on what that may look like. We just partnered with Disney and did America's Most Playful Families. And this was about not just kids playing themselves, but families playing together and lifting them up, because everybody lives busy lives. And if we can, again, show and tell stories about how people are prioritizing this, it starts to create that ripple effect that other people think that maybe the choices they're making are making them based on the wrong assumptions, and it's easier for them to do, and that this potentially could become the default position versus an occasional thing that you do as a family or for kids.
I think similar in our case, we move heaven and earth to make the positive story and to make sure it happens. And so in our case, it's not so much the beneficiaries of our programs who are not taking advantage of it, it's the providers who are not set up to provide it. So like schools in Los Angeles, when we tried to move breakfast from the cafeteria to the classroom, which is the most effective thing we can do to change numbers in a big way, the teachers objected mightily. The teachers union had a contract that said we don't clean up spilled milk or we don't have food in our classrooms, and they were just, so we finally got to the point with a lot of local partners in California. We only played a small role in this, but they said we'll do the whole thing. We'll get the food to the kids, we'll clean it up, we'll have parent volunteers in the classroom, we'll do whatever it takes. After piloting it in 30 schools, the superintendent of the LA school system mandated that breakfast in the classroom roll into all 630 LA Unified School District schools. But it was only when we just took every objection as it came, overcame them, and then if it hadn't worked, we wouldn't have pushed to expand it. But it was one of those things that became kind of self-evident for anybody that looked at it like this is a great idea. So, but as I say, we so front-loaded that effort in a small number of places. Kind of our strategy nationally is to do the same thing statewide. We think in political terms. How do we win our New Hampshire primary? How do we win our Iowa caucus, as you would if you were running for president? So we've invested disproportionately in some states, so the needle moves in such a big way that whoever looks at it says, got to have that here.
So we have time for one more question, if there's one more. No, okay. So I want to thank all of you, because we actually are just at time, for coming today, and to thank Billy and Darell, and thank you for inviting me as well. We really appreciate it, and we ask you to go home and to talk to your peers and think about how we can go big or go home, or another way to put it, how you can win the gold medal for those who need it. So thank you very much.